A lack of knowledge of the female body mysticizes it. It presents the female as animalistic, lesser, monstrous, and unknowable, all of which are traits which are often visited in the horror genre. The female body changes in more visible ways throughout a woman's life than a man does, and thus readily reveals the reality of passing time and reminds man of his own mortality. The reproductive drive stems from the recognition of the inevitability of death. By producing offspring, man hopes to create a legacy to pass along the fruits of his labor. The fear of the female body, and its various functions and forms, stems from the presentation of woman as other, man as human, and the resulting relationships between the sexes. In Lesbian Bodies, Tribades, Tomboys, and Tarts, Barbara Creed writes, Michelle Montreuil has argued that in Western discourse, woman signifies the ruin of representation. Julia Kristeva distinguishes between two kinds of bodies, the symbolic and the imaginary or abject body. In Powers of Horror, she argues that the female body is quintessentially the abject body because of its procreative functions. Unlike the male body, the female body is penetrable, changes shape, swells, gives birth, contracts, lactates, bleeds. Woman's body reminds man of his debt to nature, and as such threatens to collapse the boundary between human and animal, civilized and uncivilized. Bakhtin argued that the essentially grotesque body was that of the pregnant, birth-giving woman. When man is rendered grotesque, his body is usually feminized. It is penetrated, changes shape, swells, bleeds, is cut open, grows hair and fangs. Insofar as woman's body signifies the human potential to return to a more primitive state of being, her image is accordingly manipulated, shaped, altered, stereotyped, to point to the dangers that threaten civilization from all sides. The first major change that separates male from female is menstruation. While male puberty also happens in stages, it occurs more gradually and with less extreme changes. There is no obvious sign for men as there is for women, as while a male's first fertile emission could be taken as proof of becoming a man, it is easier to hide, private, and not demonized in the same manner as menstruation is. Menstruation, as a result of being rarely discussed, is mythologized as being an experience which leaves women as tearful, tense, weak, miserable, physically ill, mentally unstable, easily enraged, out of control, and potentially violent. Indeed, the word hormonal seems now to be used to describe any emotional reaction that observers find to be excessive. The lack of objective education and information on the topic furthers the long-standing myth of menstruation as a curse, a burden, or otherwise as a spiritual impurity. No single religion or culture is to blame. Hinduism views menstruating women as impure, resulting in the practice of women being forced to stay in huts outside of the home, without access to water. They are not allowed to bathe, comb their hair, and are excluded from daily life and religious ceremonies. As noted in A Dialogue on Menstrual Taboo, Jewish law explicitly forbids plainly any physical contact between male and female during the days of menstruation and for a week thereafter. Popular taboos restrict playing games and sports together, directly handling or receiving objects. They must be placed down onto a surface and then may be picked up by the spouse, and eating together from the same plate. In Christian mythology, women's menstruation and male emissions are both viewed as impure. However, based on the mistaken beliefs put forward by Aristotle and Pliny of the role of sperm as the life-giving component in human reproduction, and menstrual blood as the constructive matter for growth of a fetus after conception, it is far more demonized to be a woman on her period than a man who happens to ejaculate. As a result, menstruation is regarded not only by physiologists and many doctors, but also by some feminists, as a sickness, a blank spot, a non-event that the woman must endure and will be better without, an evil time. Perhaps the best example of this perspective in horror films can be seen in Stephen King's Carrie. Carrie's mother is religious to the point of being frightening to others around her. Her strict beliefs are similar to many interpretations of religious texts, leading to abusive and controlling sex. Not only does it lead to the ostracization of its followers, preventing the ability to critically think for themselves or to explore other options, but it allows for those in control of the group to exert control over those within. In many cases, this is directly related to the control of women, both for sexual and reproductive purposes. This stems from the teaching that women are inherently lesser and unclean, and thus unfit to lead or make their own decisions. In the 1976 Carrie adaptation, the titular character is first introduced as a pariah on the volleyball court. Her classmates' disapproval of her is immediately apparent after her failure to win the game. However, the true extent of her separation from her peers, both in knowledge and culture, becomes evident in the locker room, where her period starts for the first time. Chloe Rose Platt writes about the unsettling experience of a girl's first menstruation, comparing her own experience to Carrie's first menstruation, which would have been embarrassing even if she had known what it was, but which was made worse by the bullying she faced by her classmates. She writes, "With a deeply religious mother who had never spoken to her of menstruation, Carrie is overwhelmed at the sight of the blood and equates her period to some manner of bodily dysfunction. Amid her feverish confusion, Carrie's peers throw tampons and pads at her as they tauntingly chat, 'Plug it up! Plug it up!' It is within that same day that Carrie begins to experience telekinetic powers, which she will eventually use to kill her strict mother, mocking classmates, and herself. The journey that led to Carrie's climatic murders and subsequent suicide was seemingly catalyzed by her period, as her recognition of her own powers coincided with the terror she felt towards her bleeding body. Carrie's menarche was the calamity from which her sinful acts would spawn. The act of menstruation, often referred to as becoming a woman, came to Carrie late, at age 16, which is far later than most girls receive theirs. But it also brought with it the onset of her mental abilities. In turn, Carrie fulfills the long-standing fear of menstruation causing a woman to gain the ability to hurt men. Carrie, at its heart, is a revenge story, but one which is able to share the blame amongst many players. Yes, male characters such as Billy Nolan play a role in her humiliation, but the inciting action for the massacre starts with the actions of other women. Christine Hargensen is one of the girls who witnessed Carrie's first period and took part in her humiliation with the jeers of "plug it up" and the tossing of tampons at her. Carrie's mother reads from a passage titled "The Sins of Women" when she forces Carrie to recite "Intercourse was the first sin" and cites menstruation as the first curse, all while Carrie cries at having not been told about the inevitability of menstruation and the resulting humiliation she faced as a result. The shame Carrie feels and the fear she experienced are due to the actions of others, her mother and her fears. It is through a failure of empathy and the discomfort women feel with their own bodies and discussing it openly, which leads to Carrie's humiliation, her victimization, and later leads Chris to be banned from prom. Her revenge thus leads to the plan to douse Carrie in pig's blood. Another reference to menstruation, and as the volume of blood increases, so too does Carrie's power. If Carrie had been educated on what happened, if she had not been so thoroughly humiliated, if she had not felt such shame at a natural bodily function, would the culmination of her powers lead to a body count and her own suicide? The female class consciousness that might have averted this massacre was called upon by Chris during the detention, offered as alternative punishment to 3-day suspension and denial from prom. When Chris tells her classmates that they can escape punishment by sticking together, they ignore her, instead choosing to go ahead with their assigned punishment rather than risk losing prom altogether. Female class consciousness, or at least allyship, comes and goes in horror films. While feeling alone and ostracized often adds to the horror of a given situation, being able to band together and then lose that companionship is often just as powerful at eliciting an emotional response. Two characters do offer empathy and support to Carrie. Sue Snell, one of the girls who participated in Carrie's bullying, convinces her boyfriend to take Carrie to the prom as a way of making amends, an act which Miss Collins, the gym teacher, views of scrutiny, and finally admits that she thinks will look strange for Tommy to do. Miss Collins views Carrie as pitiful, annoying, and bullyable, but still insists on being kind to her anyway, by helping her understand her period, punishing the girls who were so cruel to her, and making sure that Sue is not further bullying her. Of course, these few acts of kindness do not counteract the cruelty of the other students, and only Sue survives, all of which culminates in Carrie's inevitable death and humiliation, regardless of their intent. Mother, maiden, crone. What comes after menstruation is the capacity for reproduction and sexual maturity. Many argue that girls are able to marry and have children after having this milestone, which is inaccurate. Childbirth is most dangerous in young teens, and menstruation does not a woman make. However, menstruation does often lead to the culmination of sexual activity and exploration. Libidos increase, hormones rage, and teenagers become curious about the act itself. Sexuality also offers an avenue to sexual abuse, rape, and the fear of being taken advantage of. Sexuality and horror are bedfellows for a reason. Many feminists oppose the horror genre for the way in which many films sexualize the abuse of women's bodies. Even franchises which initially do not dwell on sexual differences tend to divert towards the threat of rape as an almost universal and easily choreographed threat, which does not require much nuance to elicit a response from the audience. While in reality, the understanding that rape is bad is often hotly debated, as the victim's response and the circumstances of her rape are often judged as being insufficient to lay claim to the word. In film, it is more often presented as straightforwardly wrong. The delineation between villain and hero is clear. A major point of a successful horror film relies on character connection, and there lies a need for the ability to empathize with and root for at least one, if not multiple characters. A common shorthand to force this connection is the nuclear family. The Hills Have Eyes was released in 1977 and was written, produced, and directed by Wes Craven. It follows the Carter family, who are accosted in the Nevada desert by a family of cannibals. Much can be said of the use of the family structure itself. Unlike the Texas Chainsaw Massacre, which Craven had been inspired by, The Hills Have Eyes pits two families against one another. The outlaw family, comprised of Jupiter, who in his youth murdered his sister, his wife, Mama, a prostitute and alcoholic, and their 4 children, against the Carters. The Carters are well-off suburbanites on their way to California for a vacation in a towed RV. The families are pitted against each other in every sense, highlighting the theme of the American class divide through the use of the Carters' polished appearances, their vast family, and their lack of experience with violence. In contrast to Papa Jupiter's family, who relies on preying on passerby to remain alive, and yet are removed from society by doing so in a manner which prevents them from ever rising out of their extreme poverty. The attempt to remove Papa Jupiter and the danger he presents from society only resulted in the spread of that danger to begin with, similarly to how refusing to address the causes of poverty only leads to more poverty-driven crime. Craven was inspired by the legend of Sawney Bean, who is rumored to have been the patriarch of an incestuous family 48 strong, who murdered and ate over 1,000 people. He was particularly inspired by the manner in which the family was treated after arrest, as the civilized society proceeded to torture the apprehended family. The slow degradation of the Carter family into violence, although justified, leads to a mirror image of both families. There is little that separates them in the end besides the reason for their acts of violence, but even this can be explained as alternative methods of seeking survival and self-defense. This is even more true in the treatment and role of female characters. The start of the movie follows Ruby, the sole daughter of the Papa Jupiter family, who begs the family's only nearby point of contact, Fred, to trade with her. When he refuses, she begs him to take her with him out of the hills, to which he teases her for attempting to make herself look nice in what is ostentatiously an attempt to seduce him, and mocks her inability to function in normal society. Fred is her grandfather, who had tried to put down his son Jupiter as a child after he killed his sister and burned down the house. Thus, his reluctant trading and communication with the family can be explained as guilt for his son and his inability to kill him. And yet, Fred does not consider the possibility of Ruby's abuse at the hands of her family. He acknowledges the danger that the clan poses, and that the attention they have gathered will lead to their dissolution sooner rather than later. But despite her distaste of the cannibalism and abuse of her family, she is forced to remain with them due to the misfortune of her birth. Similarly to how women in rural America are often forced to remain in their communities due to a lack of options beyond low-income jobs and marriage, typically tied to having children. Despite Mama calling Ruby a slut and referring to her as being sexually active, it is only ever implied that she might be involved in a sexual relationship with her brothers. The rape of Brenda, the youngest woman in the Carter family, however, is unambiguous. Unlike the male members of the family, who are only targeted in a violent but non-sexual manner, Brenda is assaulted first by one brother and then the other. The premise of a group of white travelers being targeted by a raiding group from the hills in the context of the Western setting is unmistakably reminiscent of fears of Americans during the Great Expansion, in the chase to fulfill Manifest Destiny, wherein the Jupiter family illustrates many of the dangers that settlers feared, notably cannibalism and rape. The point of Brenda's rape is not to impregnate her, but more as fulfillment of won goods, in the same manner that rape during war is often viewed as a perk. This act of violence can also be interpreted as being an act of revenge on the invading middle class and changing way of life. At the start of the movie, Fred notes that the pillaging and murders have not gone unnoticed, and that soon the Air Force and road marshals will be moving in to deal with them, symbolizing the modernization of America, which has often left rural communities behind. The theme of family is inextricable from reproduction and thus from women. The intergenerational Carter family illustrates this well, as the matriarch, Ethel, and her husband Bob hold great influence over the rest of the family. Bob's decision to not use the main road is what leads to their car breaking down, while Ethel illustrates the continued power of religion in 1970s America. Her desire to hold on to tradition emerges to push back at her daughter's use of foul language, which she attributes to her living in New York City, as well as when she insists on praying before Bob goes to seek help, despite her children's protests. This clinging to tradition does not save their family from the violence of Papa Jupiter's family, and only serves to soothe Ethel's discomfort in the uncertainty of their breakdown in the desert. In the end, it is the family members who are most willing to change who are able to survive the ordeal, namely by adapting to meet violence with violence. Opposing Ethel is Mama, Papa Jupiter's wife, who is a crass, alcoholic, and large woman, representing the common critiques of lower-class families wherein substance abuse and obesity are common and viewed as moral failings. Living in squalor in Native American-like outfits made of animal skins and bones, she stands out in that she chose to be there. Unlike Ruby, who was born into poverty and violence and desperately wants to escape, Mama was born in the free world, but chose to partner with a violent, cannibalistic man. In turn, her decision to be part of this family is an act of immorality in and of itself, further juxtaposed with Ethel's faith and tradition. Even on her deathbed, Ethel deliriously complains about the dirty state of the RV and seeks out her family for comfort. In turn, the definition of a woman by reproductive ability, and thus sexuality, are prime and center within the film. It is only through continued pregnancies and reproduction with the hill folk that the group may continue to go on. It is surprising, then, that Brenda's assault in the 1977 film does not linger or fetishize, and only briefly suggests the possibility of bride napping when one of the brothers tries to drag her from the RV, only to promise to return for her later. The only reaction meant to be elicited from the act is horror, and it is framed in a manner which leaves much of what is going on to the imagination. Her assault leaves her frightened and traumatized, but she maintains an active role in the plot, as she forms the plan that leads to their decimation of the Jupiter family. In the sequel, rape is used again in the opening scenes, but builds on the fear of assault to portray a fear of forced pregnancy and captivity. The role of the setting, which takes place in the Nevada desert where nuclear testing was done, and which is implied to have caused the mutations in Jupiter's offspring, also cannot be ignored. Nuclear testing in the United States has led to health detriments, including cancer and birth defects, though much of this is only anecdotal, as the low population surveyed in studies on the topic makes it difficult to extrapolate. The Hills Have Eyes builds on fears of the downwinders, or those in communities in Utah which were downwind from nuclear testing and who were unaware of the danger posed by the mushroom clouds and radiation. While sheep were the first to be affected, later leukemia and other radiation-caused cancers appeared in residents of Utah, Arizona, and Nevada, living in areas where nuclear fallout had occurred. The misfortune of the Jupiter clan, especially in the 2006 remake, can be partially attributed to the actions of the US government, and then partially on Mama, for having children despite their obvious deformities. Female characters are prime and center in this film, and their characters have agency. While acts of violence occur to them and they face abuse, they are not defined purely as victims. Ruby's desire to leave the hills and her sympathy for the Carter family are what allows for survivors where typically there would be none. Brenda's plan to lure Jupiter into a trap ensures that he is dead, and gives guidance to an otherwise despondent group of survivors. In the 2006 remake, this is undercut by the use of more graphic imagery in the rape scenes, which linger, but does serve the purpose of horrifying the audience with the length and severity of the assault. However, the original entry centers on women and the reproducibility and sexuality as a vehicle for horror without delving into feeling exploitative or sexualized. The original Texas Chainsaw Massacre, which came out in 1974, served as an inspiration to Craven and shares quite a few similarities with The Hills Have Eyes. Both films regard groups breaking down and falling prey to a family of cannibals. Both films are graphically violent and were released during the 70s, adding to the creation of the final girl trope, who escapes the killer and gets revenge after suffering enough to earn the privilege, of course. While the movie refrains from the threat of sexual violence, it reiterates the need for the nuclear family. Female characters are only victims. No woman exists in the Sawyer family unless one counts the decomposing corpse of the grandmother, as noted in Feminism and the effects of horror films on the movement. The Sawyer family is made up of all seemingly degenerate men, with no females present other than the rotted corpse of a grandmother. The nuclear family is laser-focused on the idea of a man, woman, and children, and the Texas Chainsaw Massacre seems to stray from this, even insinuating that no women in the house can lead to violent and horrifying mass murder. There's a strong patriarchal sway in the film, with Sally suffering the brunt of the Sawyer grandfather's hunger for blood, as seen when Sally's finger is cut for him. The Sawyer family and their dwelling can be seen as the result of women abandoning their posts and fleeing the household to find freedom in the American world. Similarly, Leatherface in the dinner scene is portrayed as wearing a mask with garish makeup along the eye holes and mouth, taking on a more feminine appearance. Since he is the one doing the butchering of people in the household, in this respect, he can be seen as the woman of the household, cooking their meals after he has captured the meat. Core also suggests this, claiming that Leatherface not only cooks and prepares the meals, but is also chastised for letting his brother run amok, and is seen as the servant of the house, similar to how women of the 1960s saw themselves. The view of Leatherface as passionate and confident when no one is around, but submissive behind closed doors, is a prime example of how women are characterized at this time. Likewise, Sally is seen as the leader of the group, but she is the victim of the degenerate nuclear family, having been beaten and held hostage. Despite being seen as meat, she is also construed as the placeholder of the only female in the family, even placed there by Leatherface, to move away from the role himself slowly. However, in the remake of the film, rape, and thus the reality of sex and how horror is defined differently because of it, are made more clear. At the start of the film, the group picks up a hitchhiker who had recently escaped from Leatherface. The blood on her thighs makes it clear what happened, or at least part of what happened. Both films introduced more detailed depictions of sexual violence in their post-2001 remakes, which also coincided with the rise of pornography, the internet, and the spread of easy-access, sexually degrading and violent material. Typically, women are the focus of the sphere of sexual violence, as a reflection of the reality of gender-based violence in the real world. One movie which levels the playing field is 1979's Alien. Alien is part of a collection of pre-2000 movies, which attempts to illustrate a post-gender society, and which did so by writing all roles as gender-neutral. Ripley was intended to be cast as a man. The casting of Sigourney Weaver led to the female heroine that we all know and love. Weaver is relatively free of the sexualized gaze of the camera, except for a scene near the end, which is almost excusable in how normal and unadorned she is while stripping. The casting of a female protagonist was also interesting in that it allowed for the translation of the horror of unwanted pregnancy, which is often depicted as a passive process, despite the toll it takes on the female body, to male characters. At its core, Alien is about the loss of bodily autonomy through sexual violation and exploitation, as the alien itself reproduces through rape and the destruction of the host's body. From the facehuggers, which attach themselves to the host and offers the so-called choice of submission to oral rape or death by strangulation, onwards to the inevitable death of the host via the chestburster. The sexual imagery is a constant throughout the film, reminding the audience of the theme of exploitation, which comes not only from the xenomorph's use of the human body as incubator, but from the Weyland-Yutani group, which chose to seek the xenomorph due to valuing it as worth more than the lives of the human crew. Capitalism as a form of rape, via the exploitation of the environment, of people and cultures, is a secondary theme in the series. However, as the films go on, the occasional reminder of Ripley's femaleness, made obvious when she undresses, is made more overt as her sex plays a larger role in how the narrative treats her. As noted in Study of the Gender Representations Within the Alien series by Whitney Anspach, negative feminist critique only increased with each new release of Alien sequels, as the female hero of the film gradually adopted more stereotypically feminine traits. Ridley Scott's hero in the first Alien did not display overt weakness or romantic intentions. However, by the third Alien film, the hero was given a more traditional gender-specific role as a sexual object. The hero, Ripley, was highly sexualized through a romance with a male character, and through an attempted gang rape that failed only through the chivalry of a male character. The closing scenes of the third Alien film offered Ripley no choice but to take her own life as she finally succumbed to the alien she had so successfully fought off in the previous films. Ines argues that the death of the Alien series hero, Ripley, serves as a warning to women who might rebel against gender constraints. The fourth and final Alien film further displays Ripley's weakness by showing her lack of control over even her own death. The once strong female hero is cloned using her genes and those of the horrific aliens she had fought in all the previous films. The resulting character, while physically strong, is imprisoned, highly sexualized, and of dubious morality as she struggles with whether to side with the human race or the aliens. In the most recent Alien film, Alien Romulus, only female characters are impregnated on screen, and shots linger in a manner which is far more sexualized, due to the female characters targeted by the facehugger. Sexual violence is inseparable from gender politics, and that's especially clear as with each iteration of Alien, the role of sex becomes more apparent, and gender plays a larger role in the treatment of the characters, all the while removing agency from the characters throughout the films. The sexual freedom of women is a continual source of fear. Of course, if a woman can choose who they sleep with, they can choose who they reproduce with, or worse, not to reproduce and to just have sex for the fun of it. The sexual script between men and women is of aggressor and passive receptacle, actor and victim. When a woman strays from this dynamic by seeking her own pleasure or playing an active role in the use of their own bodies, it goes against what is expected of women, and thus scares men. This can further be seen in horror films wherein these roles are subverted with female characters who are capable of defending themselves, or even acting as predators themselves. Teeth, similarly to Carrie, uses religious misinformation and restriction as a guiding theme, which in turn leads its protagonist, Dawn, to view her desire for her fellow abstinent-only guidance counselor as immoral and dirty. It does not stop him from raping her, except, unlike many other women subject to sexual violence, she is able to defend herself with a quirk of nature: vagina dentata. The opening scene of the movie illustrates the lack of control Dawn initially has over her ability. As she sits in a kiddie pool with her soon-to-be stepbrother, who insists that she is not his sister, perhaps an omen of the current rise of incest porn, he shows her his genitals and insists that she show him hers. Whether she does or doesn't isn't up for debate, but he does attempt to molest her, leading to a deep cut on the offending appendage, which serves as an obsession from then forth. The following scene reveals that Dawn has become an advocate for abstinence, with the common comparison to sexual activity as gum, used as a metaphor for the belief that sexual activity is degrading and ruins a woman's body, similar to how one would not want to chew used gum. The dichotomy of ignorance and knowledge is evident between male characters and Dawn. Toby, the fellow abstinence-only activist that Dawn goes out with, had previously had sex, but is a born-again virgin. Her brother is well-versed in sex. Later, she seeks solace in another male classmate named Ryan, who, unknowingly to Dawn, sought to sleep with her only to fulfill a bet. While she is able to experience sexual pleasure for the first time, when Ryan reveals his duplicity, Dawn castrates him. Miseducation and misinformation are rife, as Dawn is unaware of what her own body is like and how it functions. Her textbooks hide images of the vagina. Dawn insists that women differ from men because they have a natural modesty. She is unaware of what a normal vagina should look like, and when she visits an OBGYN, she is unable to tell the difference between a normal examination and sexual assault. This experience is unfortunately common, as many OBGYNs have used the role of authority to assault patients. The different ways in which men leverage power over women through sex are explored through the male characters. From the uncomfortable lecturing of the abstinence-only group, which represents the religious oppression of female sexuality through positioning women as inherently dirty, and Toby's use of the language of the purity movement to gain access to Dawn. Brad's sadism towards all the women in his life, down to the doctor's use of his authority through his profession, and Ryan's pretense at caring. All of these are merely different avenues to gain sexual access through duplicity, to gain power any way they can. Positive male characters are slim, the only one being Dawn's stepfather, who is dedicated to her mother and who rages at his son for his role in her death. In contrast, relationships between women center throughout this film, as is common throughout many which use sexual assault as a main theme. Dawn's relationship with her mother takes center stage, who is ill and who later dies when Dawn's stepbrother, Brad, is busy having sex and ignores the mother's cries for help. While the girlfriend apologizes for not stepping in, Brad is unrepentant. This is what culminates in Dawn's decision to shift from being led by her abilities to using them for her own benefit. She recognizes that her brother has lusted after her ever since their childhood interaction, and punishes him for his role in their mother's death by castrating him. Thus, she becomes the object of sexual desire and an object of emasculation. Kelly Casey Ryan notes the role of the male fear of castration, as is repeated by Ryan as he reasons his way into Dawn's bed. She writes, "The vagina dentata is the primal myth that women's genitals are equipped with teeth capable of castration. The recurring myth prescribes that a male hero must conquer women and remove their vaginal teeth before he can safely commence with sexual intercourse. The legend bespeaks the dread of women that pervades patriarchal cultures, and the castration anxiety provoked by the monstrosity of women's genitals. Whereas Freud traces castration anxiety to the father who punishes a child's Oedipal desire, Creed revisits the vagina dentata myth to revise his account of childhood psychological development, and locate the male dread of sexual difference in the figure of woman as castrator rather than castrated. For Creed, the castrating vagina evinces the monstrous-feminine, or what it is about woman that is shocking, terrifying, horrific, abject. Feminist criticism of the vagina dentata myth reveals the deep cultural roots of misogyny and phallocentrism, linking them to the male impulse to subjugate the feminine. Going even further back, we can see cultural fears of female sexuality evident in one of the pillars of the horror genre, Dracula. The dangerous teeth in Dracula are where they should be, in the mouth, but can be compared to vagina dentata in the use of sexuality as a force of castration and emasculation, as well as a representation of the male fear of female sexuality. While Stoker supported the New Woman for the entrance in writing, cultural, and intellectual spheres, he was still stoutly against the rejection of maternity and modesty. Sexual liberation was still far off from being accepted, and was viewed as a rejection of the gender binary, and an acquiescence to immorality and the corruption of values. Laura Lindman makes this connection clear in The Fear of Castration and Male Dread of Female Sexuality, the theme of the vagina dentata in Dracula, where she writes, "Because the vampire's teeth and lips are the point of penetration and sexual contact, the physical attributes of the vampires can be seen as a modern adaptation of the vagina dentata motif, particularly because 5 of the 6 vampires are fully female, and Count Dracula exhibits characteristics of both genders. Not only are these monstrous women virulently sexual, but they also exhibit the typical attributes associated with symbols of female sexuality. As Jill Wright states, feminine symbols remain mysterious, cavernous, unpredictable, dangerous, and once life-bearing and death-dealing. The negative side of the feminine symbols is exaggerated and even rendered terrible. It is important to note that the sexually aggressive, non-maternal women are vampires who are also equipped with a set of fangs that are able to literally and symbolically castrate men. However, in order for these women to be deemed socially acceptable and restored to purity, it is necessary, as in all vagina dentata tales, for the teeth to be removed. The monstrous woman, the feral and dangerous feminine, has always been a part of the horror genre because the female body has always been feared. The use of women in horror thus serves as a reflection of the cultural beliefs of the female body in its various forms, and often the subversion of the status quo, which is in turn perceived as unnatural and wrong. A woman who is unfeminine, who is powerful, who has agency, often stars as the villain more often than the hero. And of course, at the center of horror itself is recognition of sex as a vehicle for power, and rape as a form of gendered violence. Ignorance of the female body at its core serves to further the use of the female form in horror, playing on long-standing inaccuracies and cultural misguidances to stoke fear. The male form is rarely shown in such a light. After all, male is referred to as human. One might wonder if greater understanding of women as just another type of human might have influenced the horror genre to be more egalitarian of its depictions of the body as a form of horror. This, dear viewers, is where we part. Jesus Christ, this took forever. This script was 11 pages long. In comparison, most of mine are about 3 to 4 pages. And I plan on editing this with movie clips, so I can tell this is going to take a while. But it's Halloween month, at least when I'm recording this. I watched a bunch of horror movies that I often do with my mom when I'm in town, when it's Halloween. And it got me thinking. Because I was planning on doing a review on Alien Romulus because I did enjoy it. I did think that it was a pretty fresh take on Alien. It wasn't as repetitive as most sequels were. It felt like a good entry, but I was really fixated on the scene with the face huggers being pulled out of the Asian girl's mouth and how that just felt like they missed the point hugely with that. And I had that one quote about the Tribades and Lesbians that was from my Gold Star video that I was like, yeah, I'm going to hold on to this passage for later. But then it snowballed and it turned into this way longer video because, to be quite honest, it's not the most cohesive video essay out there, but it is the path of movies that I watched this October for fun that happened to be a connection between them all. Carrie is one of my favorite movies, one of the first Stephen King books that I read. Teeth is the one that I love watching with guys, to watch them squirm. And going through all these things, it makes me realize, wow, they really do love motifs of like the female body. Pregnancy and sexual assault and menstruation and bodily changes. It all seems to reference women quite a lot. Let's write about that. Anyhow, if you guys have any comments, questions, or concerns, let me know in the comment section down below. Let me know what you think about this type of video. It's definitely not something I would do super often because of the amount of time that this is going to take for both writing and editing, but maybe something similar for Christmas with Hallmark movies. I'd be happy to take recommendations on that. Anyhow, I'll see you guys next time. Bye!